Welcome back to Sitcom Showdown, the podcast that discusses great sitcom episodes. I'm Steve, and I've got Jeff here with me.
Yes, hello Steve.
Hello Jeff, and hello listeners.
Yes.
We're trying something a bit different today.
Why not?
Yes, because we're always pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, I think we gave people advance warning of this special month, Hall of Shame.
Yes, instead of trying to find the cream of the crop, this month we're trying to dredge the bottom of the barrel or something like that.
Yeah.
You've got to convince me in this episode that whatever it is you're bringing along is a 1-star episode, not nothing above 1 star.
Yeah, that's right. It's got to be the worst of the best. So we can't just start with a terrible sitcom. Now,
that's it.
Does anything else need to be explained before I launch into this, what feels completely unnatural?
Well, I feel like we've got a completely clear idea of what we're doing here.
Oh, good. Yes, we're selecting what would ordinarily be very highly regarded sitcoms on the level of, say, to be cliched, your Fawlty Towers, your Blackadders and your Seinfelds, and trying to select very, very bad episodes of those very high-quality sitcoms.
Yes, for the Hall of Shame.
Yes, that's right. Oh, well, thank you for that fantastic intro, Steve, and I'll just get into telling you what I told Steve earlier today, the sitcom that we'll be looking at, which is, in this case, Still Open All Hours, a UK sitcom on the BBC. Now, before I tell people all about Still Open All Hours, Steve, have you watched much of it?
Very little. I think I watched 1 episode and that was it.
Ah, fair enough. Okay, well, I'll launch into it. So this is Series 3, Episode 7 of Still Open All Hours, which we know is from the BBC. It went out in early 2017. And the history of this show is that, of course, Open All Hours was a very popular show with Ronnie Barker at the helm and David Jason as young Granville. And then there was a 30-year gap after it finished in 1985. And the BBC did a special in 2013 at Christmas called Still Open All Hours. And apparently it went quite well with the viewers. So they thought, let's bring back Open All Hours. Which they did, and we've now had more episodes of Still Open All Hours than we ever had of the original Open All Hours.
Yeah.
Six series of it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is Series 3, Episode 7, the last of Series 3, and I gave up on it after this. So, now the premise of Still Open All Hours is that it's set in a small grocer's shop in South Yorkshire, focusing on the life of Granville, who is now much older, and he's the shop's owner, having inherited it from his late Uncle Arkwright. And Granville is now also a master of the evil art of sneakily selling crap to customers. But assisting old Granville with the running of his shop is his boy, Leroy. Unlike Granville, he's a bit of a local heartthrob with a robust love life outside.
When you say Leroy is his boy, it's his son?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And Leroy's a good-looking young lad, and all the local ladies are after him. Unlike Grenville's situation when he was younger, he was always pining for some romance. Anyway, but of course, because he's working all hours, young Leroy, like up probably at 4 a.m, working till 9 p.m, and then trying to go out to nightclubs or something, he gets about 1 hour sleep a night. That's neither here nor there, though. Anyway, so my justification for selecting this, Steve, which I think is important because I can see you on Skype and you're giving me a funny look, is that this is Still Open All Hours isn't some sort of spin-off. It's literally the same sitcom. It's just been there's a 30-year gap. It is not a spin-off. So, it's literally in the title. It's Still Open All Hours.
I don't know.
Okay.
I feel like we've had this argument before.
You're going to have to take it as read on this one.
I just prefer to think of it as 2 different things.
No, yes, but they're not, you say. So
because I like one a lot, I'm not too keen on the other one.
Oh, either way, you've got the same character. In fact, several of the same characters in the same shop, in the same street, with the same writer, the same creator. So it's the same team doing the same show in the same place. It's got Roy Clarke, as I mentioned, the writer and creator. You've got Mrs. Featherstone, the Black Widow. You've got Nurse Gladys Emanuel, and you've got Ditzy Mavis, of course. So I'm counting it as the same sitcom. So there. Now, with that argument superbly made, obviously, and with us having accepted it's the same show, I put it to you, Steve, that not only is this particular episode substandard and bordering on crap, as we're about to find out, but the series as a whole has devolved terribly after initially strong return.
Well, I presume we'll discuss this after we've watched it, right?
Oh, yeah. Now, before I go into the characters, have you got any comments that I can then ignore?
What did you say? Ignore?
Yeah, of course.
Well, I don't really agree that they are the same series. I think I've made that point.
Right. And what's the basis of this, though?
I don't know. I think it is just that I like one and regard it through these rose-tinted nostalgic glasses, and this one, when I've watched it, it just doesn't do the same thing for me.
Oh, good. Well, this is helping.
Regardless of the fact that it's the same place and the same characters and the same writer.
Oh.
All right, well, let's continue and see where we go with this.
Yeah, jolly good. We're off to a cracking start here. Now, let's do some characters for anyone who hasn't seen Still Open All Hours before, or dare I say, Open All Hours. Granville, who is now the owner of the shop, he's played by David Jason, also known as Sir David White. He's got a knighthood. I mean, everyone should know who David Jason is. Anyway, Granville, having lived his youth as a nice yet shy and awkward man, he struggled with shop life quite a lot. He's now changed over the last 30 years into a more toned-down version of his Uncle Arkwright. And Granville now sells goods at inflated prices. He invents stories to sell useless or unsellable items to hapless customers.
Yes, this sounds familiar.
Yeah. And he's tight with money. Now, at some point during this 30-year gap, Granville finally had a romantic fling with a lady in Blackpool, as it turns out, which resulted in his son, Leroy. And Leroy's mother, she dumped Leroy with Granville in the early times, so I don't think Leroy's ever seen his own mother. Yes.
Blackpool is a well-known romantic hotspot, is it?
Yeah, it must have been.
Much more so than Paris, for instance.
Exactly. Now, we were talking about the actor David Jason before, and he is super famous as Granville, but he was also Del Boy from Only Fools and Horses, and more importantly, Steve, he was Danger Mouse and Count Duckula. So,
well,
there you go.
That's definitely the pinnacle of his career.
Yeah.
That was surely the thing behind his knighthood.
Oh, for sure. Had nothing to do with, Detective Inspector Frost or whoever that bloke was. Ooh. Let's move on, speaking of young people, to Leroy, son of Granville. Now, he's played by a kiddie called James Baxter. Now, at the time of recording, and this show's been going for 6 years, bear in mind, James Baxter is still only 29 years old, but the good thing for him, of course, is that he's now a veteran of 6 years of sitcom working with the greats, learning all the tricks of the trade from all these brilliant actors in this show. So you'd think by now he's built up quite a big comic skill set, but we'll have to wait and see how his career develops and whether that's going to get tested out. Now, prior to...
You're saying he hadn't done anything before this?
Well, yes, he's done a little bit. He was on the soap Emmerdale for 2 years prior to this show, but, it was quite a few years before, so he must have only been 17 or something. And he'd been in an episode of Red Dwarf as well. But we'll have to wait and see when it comes to James Baxter. So now we can move on to some of the other actors who you'll know very well, Steve.
Yes.
So we've got Mrs. Featherstone, played by Stephanie Cole.
Classic.
Yes,
She's been in some stuff.
Give us some info on Stephanie Cole.
Well, I always think of her as the lady from the show set in the nursing home, Waiting for God.
Absolutely.
She's a real piece of work in that show. Well, she's a real piece of work in every show, isn't she?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, I've never seen an episode of Waiting for God, but I know you enjoy it. But otherwise, very curiously, she played the mum in Keeping Mum, which we've discussed before as being the British remake of Mother and Son.
Yeah.
And of course, Inspector Grimm was in that. David Haig.
As the son.
As one of the sons. as the flashy son.
As the Robbie son or the...
As the Robbie son.
Arthur son. We really are going to have to watch that sometime.
We are. It sounds fantastic. Ah, wow. But we're going to have more praise for Stephanie Cole later on, so we'll move past her. Now, Maggie Ala Renshaw plays Mavis, another person who was in Open All Hours, because it's the same show. But she was in another Roy Clarke sitcom, First of the Summer Wine.
Yes.
And Maggie Ala Renshaw has just finished being a regular in another sitcom from late 2019 called Scarborough, who she starred in with Stephanie Cole.
Oh.
Yeah. Now,
Blimey.
yeah, and that also had a bunch of other good comedians in it, like Jason Manford and Steve Edge and guys like this. Now, the rest of the cast, Steve, the problem with this show, which I'll contend later on, is that the cast is swollen to untenable numbers. So let me quickly run through some of the rest of the cast.
Okay.
Cool. We have a husband and wife pair of characters called Kath and Eric, and Eric is played by a well-known British comedian, Johnny Vegas. We have a chap called...
yeah, heard of him.
Yeah, he was in Benidorm and such. We have Cyril, played by Kulvinder Gia, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. We have Mr. Newbould, played by a veteran of many shows, a chap called Jeffrey Whitehead. Now, he was in Time Gentlemen Please, Dave.
Okay.
As the owner of the brewery.
Again, not selling it.
And he's the dad of Bloody Cow, Ms. Jackson. And he's also the dad of one of the two parents in the sitcom Not Going Out. Now
can we just pause there? And Cyril, he was one of the original characters, wasn't he?
No, this is a different Cyril.
Okay.
We have Mrs. Hossain. Now, she's brilliantly played by Nina Wadia, who's a sketch performer that's also been in shows like EastEnders. But she's done heaps of telly. And she's a bit of a ray of light in this show, which is nice. And lastly, we have a character called Gastric. And
Gastric?
Yeah. Gastric, played by Tim Healy. Now, he's most notably from Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, and Benidorm. Now, just some last comments about...
That name... Ugh.
Yeah.
That name's horrible. Has he got stomach trouble, or what's
yes,
his deal?
Yes, he does.
He does?
His tum's gurgling all the time. Now, producer Gareth Edwards is also the producer of Upstart Crow. Yes. And the director, Dewey Humphreys, he also directed The Right Way, the notoriously poorly regarded Ben Elton sitcom.
Yeah.
Starring Inspector Grimm himself, David Haig.
Yes.
But he's also did 10 Vicar of Dibleys as a director. So as a director, he's got a very good record and a slightly spotted record.
Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make with all this, Steve, is we've got some heavyweight actors, right? We've got a heavyweight producer, heavyweight director, and a brilliant writer with a great track record spanning back untold decades. So you'd think...
They've got to put some young blood in with the octogenarians so that in another 30 years when they want to make still open all hours.
Yeah, in space. Yeah.
They've got... in space, they've still got some people around who can be on the show.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So the assistant third unit director might have climbed up the pole by then to become producer. Who knows? Oh. Okay, let's go ahead and pretend to watch this, Steve, and come back and go through the synopsis.
So she finds one stocking in your pocket, and now she thinks you're being unfaithful.
That's right.
Unfaithful with somebody with one leg.
They nail you for one leg as viciously as two. Well, that's how they are. No sense of proportion.
It seems to me not unreasonable that they might wonder how this stocking came to be in your pocket.
I thought it were a scarf.
Hang about, just a minute. When you were removing this stocking, didn't you think, well, it's a bit, like some way from the neck?
I've heard of poor sense of direction, but that's pushing it.
So we're back from sort of having watched that particular episode of Still Open All Hours, Series 3, Episode 7. Now, before we went off to watch it, Steve, I said we would pretend to go off and watch it, but you actually had to watch it for real.
I did.
Was it the first time you've seen that episode?
Yeah, so I don't think I ever got past the pilot of Still Open All Hours.
Aha.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so this is way further on than I ever got.
Yes, meanwhile, I had a very enjoyable time watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And a smidge of Lego Masters. But what can you do?
I have to admit, I was a bit lost, so I'm hoping you're going to explain what was going on.
Oh, good. And I'm sure you and the listener will know, will notice that as we've gone through, rather than describing what's happening in this episode in a very neutral and measured way, I've done it in quite a negative way to further my case. So we have the cold open outside the shop, and the customer from the neighbourhood, Cyril, he pops up and he asks Granville what it means that the shop is now a delivery point, because there's a little sign up there that says delivery point. Now, Granville explains that if you order something online, you can have it delivered there and come and collect it. So essentially, this whole opening conversation is setting up a plot point, which is at some point we know that something's going to be delivered to this delivery point. And there's a couple of flat jokes in which, Cyril, because he has to ask what a delivery point is, doesn't want to seem stupid. Yes, well, never mind. But Leroy pulls up on the shop bike and complains about a customer who waylaid him. And that's it. That's the opening scene. And we get the intro music and cut to the next morning with a sleepy Leroy opening up the shop.
Yep.
Now, you might think I downplayed that a little bit, but I didn't. There was nothing special about this opening scene. Now, unlike this particular morning where sleepy Leroy is opening up the shop and it's dark outside, Granville gets Leroy to put the money float in the till. Now, as you would well know, Steve, anyone who tries to get money in or out of this till is dicing with death.
Yes, it's carnivorous, this till.
That's a bloody good way of putting it, actually. And in Still Open All Hours, the till is supposedly haunted by the spirit of Arkwright. So depending on what mood Arkwright is in that morning is how vicious the till is. Now, of course, the joke here is that as Leroy is putting the money in the till, we expect it to snap shut and give Leroy a hideous hand injury. But expectedly, everything goes without a hitch. Now, this is acted quite well by James Baxter, because at the beginning, he does not want to put the money in the till. And by the time he's finished putting in coins and the crowning glory of putting in the note and putting it under the note clip, he then just reaches over with total swag and drops the change bag in front of Granville without even looking, and then walks off with swagger going, "I'm the man." But Granville, meanwhile, he'd been standing behind Leroy this whole time, sniggering and rubbing his hands together, thinking any second now Leroy's going to get alligated.
You're sounding like you almost enjoyed this.
Oh, yeah, well, I did almost enjoy it, but the point I'm making is that the one time you're going to get Leroy to put the money in the till, of course this is what they're going to do. You could see it coming a mile away.
Yep.
Anyway, Leroy's swaggered off, and Granville is just going, this isn't right, and he has a go at putting some extra money in the till himself just to check, and of course he nearly gets his hand taken off. But David Jason nearly loses it at this point. You don't often see him lose his composure, but he had to put his tongue in his cheek to stop from cracking up. Anyway, Leroy, who'd gone out the back to get some bread, he comes back with it, and Granville says, now, look, he's worried about this counter space. Now, I don't know why this perfectly good counter space for the last 50 years he's now worrying about it, but anyway.
What's he worrying about? Before
he can tell anyone what he's worried about, Steve, the well-known customer Gastric comes in. Now, Gastric is the bloke that old habits, that Granville is trying to set up with Madge, who is the mean and nasty sister of Mavis. Now, much like with Arkwright's romance being thwarted by the mother of Nurse Gladys, and she did need care, and she had her mother living with her, which meant that Mr. Arkwright and Nurse Gladys couldn't get up to too much no good. Mavis has got Madge hanging around, stopping the romance between Granville and Mavis. So essentially we have 6 series of Granville trying to get Gastric and Madge together, and it goes nowhere. But anyway, this whole conversation doesn't advance whatever the plot is meant to be. It's just Gastric talking about his failed marriage and Granville trying to get him onto Madge, who actually hates Gastric. Now there's some attempts at jokes in this, but we might bring them up in the flat gags section later on. Now we cut over to the house of Mavis and Madge, and they run this hairdressing parlour, I guess you could call it, from home, around the kitchen table, and they cut the hair.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. It's a home business.
Okay.
And it's also where the ladies of the neighbourhood gather to slag off all the men. Now, for some reason, Madge is just saying to Mavis she wishes they'd gone to Australia when they had the chance. Now, this sort of just comes out of nowhere. So Madge is fed up and she's just thinking, I wish we'd gone to Australia when we had the chance. And then Mavis just says, well, I don't fancy it. It's chock-a-block full of venomous spiders and everyone's got white noses. And that's literally it, a couple of terrible gags before we go back to Granville's shop. And what they were talking about had nothing to do with anything before or after that scene. And the jokes were rubbish.
You missed one about her not speaking the language or something like that.
Yeah, it was someone they knew who went to Australia, and she went all right there because she spoke the language. Yeah, it was. I didn't think that was worthy of putting in there, Steve. So three flat gags.
Oh no, I'm making your case for you.
Thank you. Granville, because we're back in the shop now, Granville asked Leroy to come out to the floor of the shop and sort of turn to face the counter like a customer would. And, obviously he's going to demonstrate something to young Leroy. And he says, watch this. And so he thumps the counter once, and this helium balloon floats up about a foot above the counter. And it's got something printed on it, and it says, ask about. And then Granville thumps the counter twice, and a second balloon comes up, and it says, our special offers, or our latest offers. So between the two helium balloons, it says, ask about our special offers. Now, Leroy criticises this little promotional ploy by Granville here. Just saying, listen, buddy, there's hardly any room behind this cramped counter as it is, and now you want to put balloons there. And Granville says, yeah, but this is prime advertising space. We need to do something with this to attract the customers. And Leroy literally just says, can I just say one word about this? And Granville says, well, of course you can. And Leroy says, balloons. And the audience laughs. Now, obviously, that's
and you get
meant
the little, at the end of every little gag like this, you get the little...
laugh track?
The piece of music or whatever it is.
As they change scenes, yeah.
And the laugh, and you go, that's not even worth the piece of music.
No, and it's,
laugh.
Crikey. So obviously, he was just meant to say it's bollocks, but he says balloons instead. Now, that's the most charitable spin you can put on this gag, because otherwise it's not even an actual joke. It's possibly the weakest joke of all the weak jokes in this episode, and again, it's not related to anything, and it goes nowhere plot-wise, but these little scenes, Steve, they're not even little charming moments of character development, they're just, let's try out a couple of jokes, and they don't really work, but what can you do?
Well, the balloons do make a reappearance.
Oh, they do, yeah.
Not those balloons, but balloons. So there's some kind of a thread.
Yeah. We cut back at this point.
Tenuous one, to be sure.
No, it is. We go back to the home hairdressing salon at this point. Now you've got Madge, who we know is Mavis's sister, and you've got Kath, and she's married to Eric. And these two women make the Black Widow look almost reasonable. I mean, they're so grumpy all the time. Anyway, Kath's getting a haircut at the kitchen table. And we also, in the room, have Mavis. We've got Madge cutting Kath's hair. We've got Mrs. Hossain. And we also have the Black Widow herself, Steve. And they're in there drinking cups of tea. And I've put they're failing the Bechdel test and generally bringing everything down. So in a nutshell, they just point out what a bad mood Madge is in. And then, someone in the cast will say, oh, that's not unusual. Ha, ha, ha. As in making a joke about how nasty Madge is all the time anyway. So after a minute and a half, because they just say, look, we don't just come here for the haircuts and the styling. We come here to pick up tips on how to be nasty off Madge. What? Anyway, so after a solid minute and a half of man-hating, And Kath reveals, and we finally get to a bit of plot here, Steve. Kath reveals that she found a single stocking in Eric's pocket. Ooh, a woman's stocking, no less. So there we go. And so just when things are getting interesting, they cut away to a bit later back in the shop. So now this is some time later because Mrs. Hossain has entered the shop. Now she's one of the few positive characters. Anyway, she's either divorced or widowed. And actually, going back to that scene we just had around the kitchen table sometime earlier, they're all slagging off men. But Mrs. Hossain says, you know, I don't really want one around the house, but it would be nice to have one for special occasions. And I thought that was actually a half-decent gag. But they all shoot her a withering glance. Anyway, so we're in the shop and Mrs. Hossain comes in. She's either divorced or widowed or something. Anyway, she's carrying several bags in each hand or, you know, hooked over each arm.
Yep.
And so she's struggling to grab this loaf of bread off the side counter. And meanwhile, Granville Senior comes in and he hides himself below the counter. And he's going to...
Why?
Oh, we're going to find out. We're going to find out. And he's planning to spring his balloon trick, which you mentioned earlier, Steve. So Mrs. Hossain struggles to get this, you know, like T-Rex style, to get this loaf of bread, which she does, goes over to the counter, and Granville releases the balloons, saying, ask about our special offers, which frightens Mrs. Hossain, because she's easily spooked. And the loaf of bread goes flying out of her hands, and we cut to a shot of Granville still hiding below the counter, behind the counter, and the loaf of bread lands next to him. And then he stands up and says, I believe this is yours, madam, handing her the loaf of bread. And she just whacks him right over the head with the loaf of bread. Yes. And that...
I know someone who's got a phobia of balloons. For real.
Oh, really? Ooh.
I imagine that this could be a real thing.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. I buy
Don't you think it was bad form of her, though, to be bringing... She arrives in the shop and she's already done?
Yeah.
She's already got 3 or 4 bags worth of shopping.
Arkwright would not have stood for that.
He would not have. He would have just kicked her out.
He would have.
Surely.
He would have had a big conversation with her at the very least.
Come back when you've got enough. You know, when you're capable of me selling you 3 or 4 bags worth of stuff.
Yeah, it was a bit cheeky.
Anyway, sorry, carry on.
No, that's all right. So after that balloon scene in the shop, we cut to a bit later in the shop with Leroy, and then Eric and Cyril walk in. Now these two, Steve, if you have not spent much time with Eric and Cyril. Oh, my word. Okay, they are hopeless, right? So they're 2 middle-aged married men who will bring up what their purpose is in the show later on, but it's either to be duped by Granville or to be hassled by their wives, I guess is the right way of putting it. So no wonder the ladies are so annoyed with them, though, because they're just absolutely stupid. But at least they try. So they come in with a scheme, right? And they want to ask Leroy for advice, because Leroy is a lady killer. And so they say, more or less, what smooth lines can we use, Leroy, to get Eric out of trouble after Kath found that stocking in his pocket? Have you got any, you know, things that can smooth it over a bit? And Leroy says Eric is beyond help. But Granville walks in and says, look, Eric needs to lighten up a bit. And then he thumps the counter and a smiley-faced balloon pops up. Now, this is supposed to cheer Eric up, obviously. But Eric just gets the pen out of his pocket and pops the balloon right in Granville's face.
Yep.
Yes. I don't even know what to say about that. But thankfully, to get us away from all this, this chap pops into the shop. And he says to Granville, is this a delivery point? And Granville says, yeah, it certainly is. And the man says he's got a delivery. And it turns out to be a massive, truly massive, soft toy mouse, which I reckon is about 5.5 foot tall and 4 or 5 foot in diameter. It's chunky. It's the size of a person, but with more girth. But just as things are getting interesting with the arrival of a mouse, I don't even know what was funny about that, Steve. It's a fat mouse.
I was thinking of I was trying to think of a way to explain to the listeners about the size of this rabbit, because it's enormous, and I think you've done it well there by referring to its girth.
Oh, I thought it was a mouse. It's not a rabbit, is it? No. All right, I'm going to go with what I said.
No, you're right. Because of the tail, it's definitely a mouse.
Oh, good. Excellent.
But you could easily put a person inside of this thing.
Oh, I reckon you could.
Still have room to spare.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But like I say, just as when this mouse arrives and you think, oh, something's actually going to happen here, they go back to Madge and Mavis's house against all logic. And Madge is sulking in her bedroom. Mavis brings her in a cup of tea and a snack, and Mavis asks Madge if she's going to stay in there all day sulking. Madge says, Madge says, yeah, I'm thinking of going on a hunger strike because she's so fed up. And Mavis asks her, what, no lunch then? And Madge goes, oh, I thought I'd start after lunch. And I thought that was genuinely funny, the way she delivered it. And this lady is Bridget Forsyth, the actor who plays Madge. She's very good. We didn't mention her earlier, but she is a seasoned sitcom actor, as most of the cast are. That's actually a good gag. But then we get another good gag a moment later after this short scene. Now, Granville's got Cyril and Eric to sit around their table, so they're very lucky to be invited back into the inner sanctum of the shop, because Arkwright didn't often have people back into the inner sanctum of the shop. Blimey, I don't know why these two earned that privilege, but he's trying to get Eric to elaborate how on earth he ended up with a lady's stocking in his pocket. And they dilly-dally around this, and when I say they, I mean Roy Clarke. Dilly-dallies so that he can increase the number of misunderstandings and then get more jokes out of it. For example, Granville asks Eric, because there's only one stocking, if he's having an affair with a one-legged lady. And Cyril chips in by saying it doesn't matter, they'll nail you just as viciously for one leg as they will for two. Meaning it doesn't matter if Eric's having a affair with a one-legged lady, he's still going to be in the same amount of trouble. Eric explains to the lads that he thought the stocking was a scarf and that he was at the pub where a bloke pressed this thing into his hand and said, here, take this. I don't want my wife to catch me with it. And Eric thought it was a scarf and held onto it for this mystery man. And then he forgot about it. Yeah. And of course...
I don't know. That's just weak.
It is weak. He insists that this is the truth, of course, but the others think he is lying. And, well, there you go. So then, and this, I've complained all the way through this synopsis, but this scene really does do my head in. We go to a scene with Mrs. Featherstone and Kath. Now, they're standing outside talking about Mr. Newbould, but he's standing right there in between them. I think they're outside his house. And they're talking about his indigestion, which he claims is a side effect of his fear of Mrs. Featherstone. And it's a thankfully short scene, but it was completely unnecessary. It does nothing. I think you just have to give the actors some lines. I mean...
So he's supposed to be kind of into Mrs. Featherstone.
Well, okay, here's my reading of it.
Right?
Okay. So, at some point, maybe between Series 1 and Series 2, Mrs. Featherstone, much like she did with Arkwright on occasion, has decided that Grenville must be, have flipping great wadges of cash.
Yes.
And that she's available to marry a fourth husband. And so she's got her sights set on Grenville. And I think she's using Mr. Newbould to make him jealous. And he's her backup option if she can't snare Grenville.
Oh, goodness.
And because she's a force of nature, and because he's a very polite chap, she just brushes off any objections he has to becoming her new beau. And then she just keeps going round there and keeps taking him out and keeps associating with him despite all his protestations.
Because she says something here to the effect of, if you play your cards right, you might be able to take me out on a picnic.
That's right.
And I jumped to the conclusion that he must be interested in her.
No, she's told him he's interested in her. And he ain't got no choice. And this is part of why it falls down, which we should save for later.
They all hate men, but they all are kind of interested in men.
Well, yes and no.
As well. So.
The single ones are, the married ones aren't.
Right.
And of course, Madge isn't.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, so this is, and I'll do a spoiler, is that what this comes down to for me is that it used to be a battle between Arkwright and the people of the town buying stuff. It was a battle of commerce. And this, especially in the later series of Still Open All Hours, has become a battle of the sexes. Now, that was always a good part of Open All Hours, but now it's like the whole thing of Still Open All Hours, and it's not done very well. Anyway, let's move on. This is where it starts to get into a bit of classic Arkwright sort of territory, so I'll give you what's going on. After this Mrs. Featherstone scene, back in the shop, Mavis comes in to see Granville. Now, Granville tells Mavis she's just in time to get a ticket on the bus to Paradise, which is leaving from his bedroom shortly, Steve. Mavis says it's a bad time for buses to Paradise because Madge has taken to her room and she's sulking. Now, presumably, this means Mavis has to look after her. Now, this is silly, and I referred to this before, because Madge is a highly capable woman. It's not like she needs a carer. It's a very different situation to Nurse Gladys Emanuel's sickly mother who needed a lot of care. Now, we're supposed to buy that Granville and Mavis can't do some canoodling above the shop because Madge is at home sulking in her bedroom and is grumpy. Now, this is ridiculous.
Yes, I'm completely bamboozled as to how a pair of 60 or 70-year-old people are thwarted in their attempts to have a canoodle.
Yeah.
By the fact that her sister's laid up in bed.
Yeah. Deliberately not actually being sick. She's just a bit fed up. We just have to ride with it, I suppose, as a viewer of the show.
She's about to cause Granville to go to ridiculous lengths to try and turn her mood around, I guess.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, so in order to get some canoodling done, Granville suggests if he can convince Gastric to cheer up Madge, or at least distract Madge for a little bit with a show of passion, then him and Mavis might be able to get some time alone. So, cue this week's ridiculous scheme to force Gastric and Madge together, Steve. And by the way, they can't stand each other. Now, of course, they don't bother...
Hang on. Whoa. So why does Gastric let himself get involved in this ridiculous scheme?
Well, because it suits Granville's agenda. So he needs someone to take the heat off him with Madge, and Gastric just happens to be there and is available. So he's trying to convince Gastric that he loves Madge and trying to convince Madge that she loves Gastric. So Gastric's
just such a weak-willed person that he will be told.
Well,
he will do whatever he's told, essentially.
Yeah, more or less. He does complain from time to time, but he also does like the idea of a bit of female companionship. So where are we in all this? Okay, so we've got to the point where it's this week's ridiculous scheme. So, they're about to tell us what that is, but then they cut away again to a scene of Cyril and Eric in the park where Eric's trying to figure out how the hell he's going to get out of this stocking mess. Now, he suggests to Cyril that they tell Kath that Cyril put it in Eric's pocket as a prank to get Eric in trouble. Now, Cyril's not down for that, saying that Eric never helped him out with a lipstick incident, and we can take it from context that Cyril's done something naughty. Anyway, Eric points out that Cyril was guilty during the lipstick incident, whereas Eric, is innocent, which may or may not be the case. After that little park scene, though, we go back to the shop, and Leroy is serving Mrs. Hossain. Now, Mrs. Hossain fancies Leroy, Steve, which I'm sure you picked up with the subtext of the whole thing.
Yeah, okay, so this is what I thought you were referring to this scene.
Earlier, yeah.
Right, yeah, okay.
No, this is...
Carry on.
Okie dokie.
I'm ready.
Yeah. So Mrs. Hossain's already been into the shop, but she's now come back into the shop for a bit of gossip about Eric and the stocking, and also to try and seduce Leroy. Now...
She's got hands free this time.
Yeah. Well, she needs them to handle Leroy. Now, in real life, she's 20 years older than Leroy, but I think in the show... the actress can play quite young, and she could be anywhere from late 20s to late 40s, depending on camera angles and such. Anyway, the point is that she's trying to seduce Leroy by talking about the stocking business with Eric and Kath, and Leroy's there, he's sort of squirming. But then Mrs. Featherstone and Kath walk into the shop, and the Black Widow asks if Granville is in, and Leroy says no, he's out, but he'll be back soon. And there's a bit of argy-bargy between the Black Widow and Mrs. Hossain, where the Black Widow takes a few digs at her being a single mother and something. Anyway, we soon switch to a scene out in the street, and we figure out why Granville is not in the shop to be harangued by the Black Widow. because he's out in the street with Gastric trying to cheer up Madge by haphazardly hoisting up the smiley face balloon we saw earlier to Madge's second-story window. And it must be a second smiley face balloon because Eric popped the first one.
Yes.
And we see Madge from her bedroom point of view, lying in bed, looking out the window, and this smiley face balloon pops up. And all she does is groan. She's not curious. She doesn't, she just thinks, oh, it'll be those morons out in the street trying to do something. And so then we get the cumbersome giant mouse somehow being hoisted up on poles by Gastric and Granville. And she sees that that appear in through her bedroom window view. And just as she's ignoring the giant mouse, predictably, Gastric and Granville drop it into the street, where it gets run over slightly by a vehicle, breaking its tail. Now, bear in mind, Steve, they don't actually own this bloody mouse. Someone's going to be there to pick it up at any time, and they've taken it out of its plastic wrapping, and they're now doing this stupid plan to try and cheer up Madge. It defies belief, Steve. So they decide to up their game at this point instead of giving up and do a bit of classic Artwright ladder work. Hey.
Okay.
Now, we all remember Ronnie Barker going up the ladder to try and get to Nurse Gladys Emanuel.
Yes.
Oh, yes. But this doesn't go that well.
Yeah.
So they force Gastric to go up the ladder with the mouse, which is highly hazardous, I would suggest. Madge can see the mouse with Gastric's smiling face next to it, but everything sort of tilts off to one side as the ladder falls sideways. And Gastric and the mouse are soon lying in the street, and Madge comes out the window and chucks a bucket of water over them from the second story. All over the mouse and Gastric, soaking both of them. Oh, dear.
Yeah. It's, you carry on.
Yeah, it'll all be over in a couple of paragraphs.
It's not getting better.
It's not getting better. So the rest of this episode, because I was losing patience taking notes at this point, the rest of the episode is Granville...
So we're going to yada through the rest.
Going to yada through the rest. Yeah, so you got Granville and Leroy and Gastric. They're all trying to dry the mouse out using various stupid methods, right? So I should point out, they've given up at this point on cheering up Madge. So that renders everything else in the episode completely inconsequential. So the rest of the episode is spent... Yeah, trying to dry out the mouse before it gets picked up by the person. So they use all these methods, most of them stupid, involving a rope to try and swing the mouse around to get some air going around it so it will dry. And then they hit a cyclist with the mouse. They don't help the cyclist that is sprawled out in the middle of the road.
No.
They just grab the mouse and they're trying to hang it out the window and swing it back and forth to dry it. And anyway, they decide to put it on the top of Gastric's Mini and take it for a drive in the country to air it out. And as they're hooning along the country lane, a tractor pulls out in front of them, so Gastric has to slam on the brakes, and the mouse flies off the roof, lands in the road, completely messed up.
This is so bad.
Now, meanwhile, the thing they've...
Can you tell me?
Yes.
So Madge throws one small bucket load of water... not even full, out her window, and this entire rabbit, in all its girthiness, is completely saturated.
Yes. It's I had the same point as well.
You would have to have the hose on it for 5 minutes to get it that wet.
Yep. Oh, well, we have to suspend our disbelief there, Dave.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm also... this is probably a good point to say. Arkwright's is a small corner store that is probably within a 5-minute walk of all of its customers. Well, in what reality would someone get this massive mouse delivered to their corner store and presumably pick it up on foot from there?
I don't know.
Don't you have home delivery in the UK?
Oh, yeah, but they might be a working single person, Dave. That's my theory. And so they're out at work in a different town and they won't be home when Mr. Man comes to deliver the mousey. Is that convincing enough?
Oh, I don't know. So Granville's getting a fee from the shop selling the mouse in order to provide this service, or
is
he just using it as something to lure people into the store? Yeah,
well, both. It's just like click and collect, isn't it? So you can buy stuff off eBay and they deliver it to Woolies for you, and you can pick it up for Woolies when you do your shopping. I thought it all seemed above board. Does it not seem above board? Anyway, they'll bend any logic they can to try and get a plot or a gag.
It makes as much sense as anything else.
Bang on. Very well put. Oh, where on earth were we? Oh, yes. So this mouse has been in the middle of the road and it's all messed up. And so from here...
Tractor ran it over.
Yeah, Roy Clarke's given up at this point, and it's the end of the episode, so we cut to the traditional open all hours closing monologue, where we hear what used to be Arkwright's thoughts as he packs up the merchandise that he puts out in the doorway each morning. But of course now we're hearing Granville's thoughts as he's packing up all the merchandise. Now usually, Steve, these thoughts they're beautiful and funny musings on what's happened to him in the day and the meaning of life and all these sorts of things.
Yep.
But we just get Granville admitting that he had to pay for a damaged mouse, and as he's packing things away, Gastric comes up and he tells Granville Madge has got a dripping tap and that she's called Gastric to come and fix it, because he is a capable handyman. He points out that although Madge doesn't like him, she still calls him when something goes wrong, and he goes off with a smile on his face to, you know...
Yes, and he runs along.
Yeah.
He runs along like a little dog who's been beckoned.
Yeah. So as Gastric runs along, he's off to fix Madge's tap. Mavis approaches and she invites Granville to come out for fish and chips, which is lovely. She says that Madge is busy with a dripping tap, and so Mavis is free to go out. And we discover that it was Mavis what sabotaged the tap. Oh. And therefore, Mavis, who's supposed to be the silly one, but she's not really, did a much better job of bringing Madge and Gastric together than Granville's pathetic schemes. And then, anyway, we'll wrap this up. The camera pulls back as Mavis and Granville are carrying the giant mouse back into the shop, and we get the beautiful open all hours music. And that's the very, very end of the episode.
Yes.
Oh, here's what I think we should do, Steve. I think we should make this a bit of a positivity sandwich in which the few positives you've noted down we can put in between the lambasting I just gave this episode and the rant that is to follow. So
the wafer thin notes I've got on half decent gags are going to be sandwiched between two massive pieces of
criticism.
Yep.
Okay. Hit us with your stuff you thought was least objectionable.
Well, the bit about the till being fine when Leroy goes to use it, that was passable.
Yep.
And I also thought, the bit that actually preceded that where Granville and Cyril having a chat, and this is interrupted by Leroy coming in on the bike. I thought the timing of his horn noise coming into that, interjecting into their conversation was well done.
Oh, good.
The popping of the balloons, I actually liked the popping of the balloons, just because it was unpredictable.
Oh, okay.
Like so much of this episode was flagged or signalled well before the actual gag arrived, but that actually came a bit out of the blue. So I gave that some kind of decent marks. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of that list.
Crikey!
Of things that weren't too bad.
Okay, that's a small list. Ooh. Okay, well, I'll launch into my rant on open all hours as a whole, and then we can talk about some gags.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We're still open all hours, which I still contend is a continuation of open all hours, because it is. Series 1 of Still Open All Hours was very good. Now, the pilot wasn't too flash, and in fact, I was reading today that it was critically panned, but the viewing numbers were so good, and they got such good feedback from the audiences that they brought a series on. And the series, I actually found it very good. Now, it had Linda Barron as Nurse Gladys still in the cast. It had some great scripts, and when you saw that after 30 years, it was just this rush of nostalgic loveliness, really, that was bang on the mark. As I might have said earlier, young Leroy, James Baxter in Series 1, and this is the great tragedy of Still Open All Hours, is he wasn't quite there yet. But everything else was in place. Now, there were heaps of witty zingers, because I went back and watched a lot of Series 1 to compare to this episode, and Series 1 has got some absolutely top-shelf material. The usual crafty insights into human nature, and these beautiful scenes in which Granville's teaching Leroy the tricks of the trade. Now, there's none of that in Series 3. Now, when Series 2 came around, James Baxter as Leroy came in swinging, right? He was much improved. but everything else was gravitating towards diminishing returns. And Series 2 was still pleasant enough, but Series 3 was just this diabolical letdown, and Nurse Gladys was gone. It was clear to me, or I thought Roy Clarke had just completely run out of ideas and was recycling already recycled plots and gags. And then since then, I haven't watched Series 4, 5 or 6. And so here's what's wrong with the series as a whole. Three things happen every week in less convincing ways each time. Granville wants to have time alone with Mavis, so he has to get Gastric to do something stupid to distract Madge.
Yep.
Meanwhile, Eric and Cyril are either in trouble with their wives or they're sucked into buying something stupid from Granville as an aphrodisiac because they both want to introduce more intimacy into their marriage. And let me give you an example of not an aphrodisiac, but a thing. You remember the frats, of course, Dave.
Oh, yes. Okay.
When Arkwright needed to get rid of a bunch of old kerosene lamps, and he sold them as frat detectors, and it's a cross between a ferret and a rat, and Ronnie Barker was selling these to people. Okay.
Starting to ring a bell now.
Yeah. It's a classic open all hours thing. The frats. They get in the walls, but you can't see them. Okay, so Roy Clarke's tried to do this again in Series 3 with smidges. They're like midges, which are little biting, flying insects, but they're so small they're undetectable to the human eye. And because he's bought too many turnips, Granville has, he slices up these turnips and he sells smidge detectors, i.e. slices of turnip attached to your ankle by an elastic band, to Eric and Cyril who buy it.
Oh,
anyway,
my goodness.
So that's selling Eric and Cyril stuff because they're morons. Now, plot 3 is Mrs.
Does Leroy go along with this? Does Leroy participate in this smidges scheme?
No, he shakes his head in wonderment at all these schemes and says it'll never work.
Right.
The other plot is Mrs. Featherstone chasing after Granville while stringing along Mr. Newbould, who can't stand her anyway, but he's too spineless to speak up. Now, Mrs. Featherstone used to be this evil, inflexible adversary, but now she lusts after Granville and gets quite stupid about it. The thing about the Black Widow is her and Arkwright used to joust over the counter. It was a battle of wills.
Yeah.
It was pure gold. He'd be trying to get her to buy things and she would refuse. Now, these days it's not about the challenge of the purchase and the commerce. There's nobody to resist Granville's schemes, because the Black Widow isn't resisting anything he's doing. Nurse Gladys is not there to keep Granville on the straight and narrow, because she sees through all his tricks in Series 1 and 2 and says, don't pull that crap with me, Granville. I saw it from the master. But none of that's there from Series 3 onwards. There's no adversary for Granville to battle with. So that's what I think is a problem as well. Here's one last problem, Steve-O. In Still Open All Hours, there's this reliance on gadgets and gimmicks, right? So we saw the mouse in this one, the giant mouse. And then in another one,
right,
Granville's got a wind-up spider so that he can scare the customers, so he can sell them, Dr. What's-his-name's nerve tonic. Now, not only does nobody even stock nerve tonic anymore, but, you can see where I'm going with this. And so every other episode, there's some sort of gadget or robot or thing to get a few laughs from that Granville spends money on, and yet at the same time, he won't buy Leroy a vehicle, and Leroy still has to use the shop bike. This is what I mean about recycling the same old stuff.
Yep.
It's all gone to pot, Steve-O.
Well, can I, before you get off this subject...
Yes?
I'll still contend that this is not Open All Hours, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples.
Okay.
The scene where the ladies are sitting around the table. Like, this is some other sitcom. This is not Open All Hours. This has nothing to do with people selling things meanly in a shop.
No.
I don't know. I didn't know. I was completely lost. And this seems to be set. Like, this is something that people might have done in the 60s or 70s.
Exactly.
Having this kind of a conversation around a cup of tea, and the ladies are all having a natter, going on about how the husbands are and all this sort of stuff. But this is set in 2016, 2017.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah. You're quite right. Look, so there's this wildly expanded cast is no good. So there's way too much of their lives, pointless chats inside their homes, as you say.
The scene with the guys at the park. I don't know. It's just not. Anyway.
I agree 100%.
couple of other things. The scene where they've got the two guy customers, Cyril and
Eric,
back behind the counter for a cup of tea. What is that?
No.
That's hallowed ground back there.
It is.
There's no way they would be allowed a glimpse of the superbness of that area. And
because that's where all the evil schemes are hatched. You don't let them in. You don't let the suckers into where the sausage is made. And furthermore, if you start having...
It's like the wizard seeing behind the wizards thing in The Wizard of Oz or something like that.
Exactly. Oh, my goodness. And it's dangerous, Steve, because if you start talking to people and asking them about their problems, then you start caring about them. And once you start caring about them, you can't rip them off. So what is Granville thinking? This is just terrible.
And then to cap all that off, it's the middle of the day. They both leave the shop to drive around in a Mini in the country trying to dry out a soggy mouse.
Yeah. Now, we've had whole episodes where it's impossible to get Arkwright to leave the shop, even for a funeral, and he's ringing the shop or doing whatever. It's just, So, look, between Eric and Kath and Mr. Newbould and Mrs. Featherstone and Cyril and Mrs. Hossain and Madge and Gastric and Leroy's girlfriend's friend's boyfriend. Oh, I haven't mentioned that. In the last couple of series, Leroy's got this girlfriend who's engaged to someone else, and of course she's got a friend who's always getting in the way of Leroy's life. So he's trying to set up his girlfriend's friend with other guys to get her out of the way. And there's whole episodes spent on all this sort of stuff set in cafes and stuff. And I know you're using this as a way to say it's not the same sitcom, but it is the same sitcom that's just gone very, very badly wrong. Well, for all the reasons I convincingly listed before.
Yeah, maybe they lost their way over a period of time and it became less and less of the shop and more of these other things or something.
Look, when Nurse Gladys went, that was the end, I think. And they could have stopped it there, and it would have been ace. It would have been a beautiful addition to the canon.
What else have you got?
Oh, well, I thought we'd go into gags, unless you've got any more good points to make.
So these are bad gags.
Yeah. Oh, right, I thought you'd give us yours.
Oh, I can. It's a very short list.
Yeah, go for it.
Is it Cyril comes in and says to Leroy, I saw you with your tart last night, which is just horrible. But then Leroy follows it up by saying, hey, that was grade A real estate.
Yes.
I'm thinking, what? No, I'm not overly precious about these sorts of things, but that is just completely outrageous. Way to describe a young lady.
A young lass.
Both as a tart or as a piece of real estate. And then they follow it up with a gag where Granville says something like, you'll need, and this isn't offensive, this is just poor. He says something like, you'll need planning permission before you tamper with that. I can't even read my own writing.
No, you nailed the gag. That's what it was.
Before tampering.
He said, steady on, Leroy, you'll need planning permission before you make any...
alterations of that property or something like that. Ugh, yeah. That was just so cringe.
What other gems of gaggery have you got?
I haven't got any others.
Okay. Well, I think it gets off to a really...
Tell a lie. I've got one here. He says, I think it's Granville says, he or she is immune to nasty. They used to work for an energy company. That's a bit of a head scratcher.
Normally, we can pick things up on context, and I suppose the context is there that British people don't like their energy companies, and, you know.
So they just so they were in like the customer service section and used to get a lot of complaints or something like that.
Yeah, but I can't imagine Gastric ever working in the customer service section of an energy company.
He doesn't seem the most customer service oriented kind of person.
No. The energy company would have been keeping him away from the public at all costs.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, look, I haven't got any more. What have you got?
Look, I've got some that'll make you weep, Steve. So it starts off badly from the get-go. So you've got Cyril. This is the first opening conversation. Cyril's asking Granville what a delivery point is, right? But because he doesn't want to seem stupid, Cyril says, look, I was top in school in geography. And then he says it's because he was the only one in class who knew where Calcutta was. And then, I don't know why, but Granville asks him where Calcutta is. And he goes, it's just down the A19 as far as York. That is, by any objective standard, not funny. It's incredibly weak. And then, of course, at some point when Granville is talking to Leroy and saying, Leroy, stop complaining about these early starts, he actually does this, Steve. He actually whips out the "when I was your age, we had to get up before we went to bed" gag. Did you spot that one?
Oh, it did pass me by, but it was... Yeah.
This is one of the most famous jokes in the world, and he's actually had the audacity to insert it in there, and oh my goodness. Now, straight after that, there's a bad joke where Leroy is telling his dad that when he looked at this girl, Georgina Middleford, he could hear music. Pause. And then Leroy says, it's fair enough, he was in a disco. I mean, what is this stuff, dude? This is amateur hour. Oh my goodness.
Now, if this guy had never written a sitcom before, let alone a half-decent sitcom, you'd just say, well, you know, it is what it is. But the fact that he's written one of the greatest of all-time sitcoms...
He's written more than one of the greatest of all time. He's written several greatest of all-time sitcoms. I mean, Roy Clarke, come on.
Yeah, so he's unfortunately being judged here against his own great work, really.
That's an extremely good way of putting it. Oh. But let me continue, Steve. Gastric and Granville are having a little exchange, and Gastric says, my wife said that in her very last letter, i.e. that Gastric is not a very good judge of women. And Leroy says, oh, I'm sorry, is she dead? And Gastric says, no, she's living with a bloke in Luton. Now, that's an old gag as well. But then he tells the story, I came home and there was a note and a last dinner of macaroni and cheese. And Gastric says, I could forgive her the bloke in Luton, but macaroni cheese?
Yeah.
And this is what they're serving up. It's supposed to be funny. You know, oh, my goodness. After this giant mouse gets delivered, Dave, Granville says, out of nowhere, I should add, I think we're going to need a bigger cat. And then that's the point at which I stopped counting the bad gags. I just gave up at that point. And
so what was it about this episode that made you snap to the point of saying, that's it, I'm done, I'm not going to watch any more of this?
It was everything I've just been talking about.
Okay.
Just that none of the gags worked. The plot was paper thin and they did nothing to advance it. And then when they did, they completely abandoned it. So there's virtually no plot. The same retreads of things. None of the gags really seemed to land. And like ordinarily I wouldn't mind. And if this was something like, say, Time Gentleman Please, or your Swiss Tony, I'd be going, this is pure gold. But because it's such a waste of brilliant actors and a writer who should be up there producing still top shelf stuff after all these years, and just for it to have fallen so far, it's terribly depressing, Steve. It's just, there's no stakes or consequences. There's no challenge for Granville, no one for him to go up against, nothing tricky to shift. Just scenes that exist to cram in gags that aren't worth cramming in.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
Given that I'm exhausted and out of criticism, should I just ask you if you think it's 1 star, or do you have a bit more boot to put into?
No.
Still open all hours.
I just find it depressing that this is what's become of open all hours. What would Ronnie Barker make of this? David Jason should know better than continuing on with this.
Well, he's doing his best. The whole cast are doing their best.
Yeah, but he doesn't have to. It's not like he needs the work.
No, that's true. That's very true. And they've done 3 more series.
I know. I mean, how much worse could it have gotten since then? Who knows what it's like now?
Okay, so give us your verdict, El Judgo Stevo.
Barely even 1 star. It's going into the Hall of Shame. For shame.
Our first entry into the Hall of Shame. Hooray! And boo.
You got that one right between the big sticks?
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that, but I'm not sure if we should do a Hall of Shame month next year, because it's just... Look, have you done anything towards whatever your choice is going to be next fortnight? Have you gone through the agony of...
Look, I've had this picked out for about 12 months, because I watched it and just thought, oh my goodness, what have I just seen? Anyway, more about that in a fortnight's time. Why? What are you suggesting we just...
No, it's just, I think, if you've been sitting with it for a while, there's a danger that, much like people who suffer from Stockholm Syndrome, this 1-star episode you've picked out, you might just grow to love it accidentally against all your better judgment.
No, I've got things I've got to get off my chest.
All right, cool.
Yes.
Well, thank you for sitting through all that, Steve. I very much appreciate it.
No worries. I hate to think what is going to happen if we put this up on the Open All Hours Facebook page and people actually listen to it.
Yeah,
Because there's a lot of people that still love this show.
Yeah, they might bar us from the shop. But look, they need to realise that this is coming from people who just love Open All Hours and are just a bit disappointed.
Well said.
Oh, thank you.
Alrighty, I guess we could sign off.
Okay, dear listener, we will be back in probably around a fortnight-ish, where it will be Steve's turn to select something for the Hall of Shame.
Yeah, come join us in a fortnight as we put the boots into something else.
Oh, absolutely. All right, well, thanks again, Steve. Thanks again, listener. And it's bye-bye from me.
Okay, see you, everyone. Bye.
Join us next time on Sitcom Showdown when we'll be putting another 5-star episode under the microscope. And in the meantime, you can contact us with feedback on Facebook, Twitter @Sitcom Showdown, or by email sitcomshowdown@gmail.com.